there are other people for whom there is a literal butcher's slaughtering knife hanging over their heads. In recent years, between 2006 and 2012, you have 60,000 African refugees entering Israel. These are the people I spoke of earlier, mainly from Eritrea and Sudan, in East Africa. Now, by way of analogy, let me show you a few images to paint a picture. So, these photographs of people walking onto a luxury liner. You see them boarding the boat, ship sailing. They're on deck, taking photographs. They didn't call them selfies then, they just called them photographs. So you're taking photographs and smiling and laughing and chilling and posing with their families and with their friends and on their own. And you can see clearly they're having a time of it. This guy is roller skating on deck. You see a man holding a glass of wine, casually sipping. You see other women lying in lounge chairs. Dining halls look very attractive, first-class facilities. Now, all these images I'm showing you are of the SS St. Louis. Now, I don't know if you know about this ship, but a little history lesson. So on the very eve of World War II, when it was already clear what Hitler had in mind for European Jewry, it was still possible for at least some German Jews to escape. And so you have this boat leaving, disembarking from Hamburg, and carrying on it almost 1,000 Jewish people trying to escape the Holocaust to come. And they got to North America, they crossed the Atlantic, and no country would have them. This country rejected them outright. The United States refused to accept anyone. The Caribbean countries wouldn't have it. And so, because they wouldn't take any of these Jewish refugees, the boat was forced to turn back and return to Europe, and almost all the people on board ended up perishing in the concentration camps. Now, why am I telling you this story? Yes, this man is roller skating on board. Yes, these people are sipping wine and having a good time and posing, and they're wearing nice clothes and they're embracing and they're smiling. But there's not one person in this room who would claim that they're not refugees. They ran away from Nazi Germany, and they were forced to return to Nazi Germany, and they died in Nazi Germany. They're refugees in any sense of the word, and I can hardly imagine anyone claiming otherwise. And yet, these people are refugees, but Israel claims that these people aren't. According to the Israeli government, these people, stuck like sardines, trying to escape any way they can, dying by the thousands, drowning in the Mediterranean, running in every direction, filling up refugee camps all over the African continent and in Europe, Africa, in other parts of the African continent, and further on in Europe and North America and Australia. But according to Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government, none of them are refugees. They are all just trying to make a quick buck. And that's why they've come to Israel. Yeah. Risking their lives, giving their lives to make a quick buck. Well, when these 60,000 African refugees came to Israel, walking through the Egyptian Sinai desert, it didn't look that different from the mythical story of the biblical exodus from Egypt. This is what the border between Egypt and Palestine looked like 100 years ago. It probably didn't look that different in 2006 when these African refugees began streaming over the border. Until a couple years ago, this is what the border looked like. Now, clearly, it wouldn't be fun to try to get over it. There's barbed wire, you get caught in it, but obviously not insurmountable. And that's how these people entered Israel, and none of them snuck in. Every single one of them abided by international law. They crossed the border. They didn't try to go any further. They waited there. They waited for the Israeli army patrols to come by. Army came, collected them. They went where they were told to. They had medical checkups to make sure they didn't have any communicable diseases. They went through security checks to make sure they didn't have police records and they weren't terrorists. And they were allowed to enter Israel. Now, that's ended because the government wanted to end this migration to prevent any more Africans from coming into the country, and so it spent billions of dollars to build this high-tech fence along the border. So now that's it, no more African refugees coming into the country. But what about the 60,000 that are already there? The government ignores almost all of the applications, so 80% of their asylum requests are just outright ignored. And for those asylum requests that they do respond to, almost every single one is a rejection. So of those 60,000, Israel has granted refugee status to 4 Eritreans. 4. But I bet those 4 are the best damn refugees. I bet they really suffered. Yeah. Well, it's so bad that, if you can imagine this, the United States of America actually grants asylum to more Israelis every year than Israel grants to Africans. And it gets worse. So this is a law that was passed by the United States Congress a year ago. You guys, we have these omnibus bills here in Canada too, right? Where the government tries to pass this legislation. It's like 1,000,000 pages long. It's got everything's in it. You're never going to read it, but they just cram it all through. So in the same way, Congress does the same thing, passes these massive bills. And a Twitter follower of mine alerted me to the fact that buried in one of these bills, deep, deep, deep inside, they found this paragraph that stated, $15 million shall be made available for refugees settling in Israel. And this is just last year. In the last decade, the US government has given hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel to resettle refugees. Wow, I mean, that's amazing. With all these 60,000 African refugees, here the United States is stepping up and helping them out, helping them, get on their feet, provide them with some sustenance so that they can rehabilitate their lives. Well, not so quick. Instead of giving that money to help these poor people, what the government has done, Netanyahu has simply transferred the funds to his friend and ally, Natan Sharansky, the head of the Jewish Agency. That's a sectarian group that by mandate it only aids Jews and no one else. And so instead of this money actually being used to help legitimate refugees, these hundreds of millions of dollars are shunted aside and they go into Sharansky's pocket or into the budget of his organization, supposedly to help Jewish families who immigrate to Israel. So if it's not bad enough that they don't grant any refugee status, they take these hundreds of millions. And if they don't accept any African refugees, who do they accept? Well, these 2 men, top Ukrainian officials, just in the last few months, now the United States government, yes, it sends millions to Israel, but it also sends millions of dollars to the Ukraine. In recent years, it's contributed tens and hundreds of billions of dollars to the Ukraine in order to support democracy and democratic institutions in that country. These 2 Ukrainian officials absconded from the country with that money. They took those tens of and hundreds of billions of dollars, and they fled to Israel. And within hours, they were granted refuge in Israel. Now, Israel's relationship with Africa is, let's face it, a pretty sordid one. When we look at the Israeli economy, one of the pillars of the Israeli economy is the diamond industry, and that's very heavily based on exploited African labor. And one of the other top industries of the Israeli economy is the defense industry. Proportionately, Israel is actually the biggest defense manufacturer and distributor in the world, in proportion to its population GDP. And I'm sad to say it, but this photograph isn't from Auschwitz. These skulls and bones aren't in black and white, they're originally in color. This photograph wasn't taken in Europe, it was taken in Africa. These bodies, how many of them died because of Israeli weapons? During the genocide in Rwanda, while it was ongoing, Israeli arms manufacturers continued to sell arms and ammunition even to those militias who were perpetrating the genocide. And this went all the way up to the top. Top Israeli officials knew it was ongoing throughout, and they permitted it to continue with their blessing. Now, that's why this man, he's an Israeli professor, he's filed Freedom of Information requests because he demands that we get to the bottom of this and that we open up these files and we have a long look at what really went on and who was responsible. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And he brought it to the courts, but the government has stymied his efforts, and the judge has refused thus far to open up those files. And so at this point, we don't know the full extent of Israel's participation in that horrendous genocide. But thankfully, the courts do come to the help of people who need it on occasion. And in the case of African refugees, they've actually come out in their favor, not once, but twice. So the Israeli government, determined to round up these African refugees into detention centers and from there deport them back to Africa, passes a law authorizing itself to do so. It comes to the Supreme Court and they say no. These people have done nothing wrong. They've committed no crime. They do not deserve to be behind bars. You must release them immediately. Instead of abiding by the Supreme Court decision, the government just flipped the script and authorized a new version of the same law, this one even more draconian than the first version, and again, authorizing it to round up Africans. And once again, it comes to the Supreme Court, and again, they strike it down. It's the only law in Israeli history that the Supreme Court has struck down twice. You would think they would get the message, but no, the government is so determined to ethnically cleanse the country of non-white, non-Jews that it legislates a third version of the exact same law so that it can continue to round up Africans. And this is the state that we're in currently. So without any work permits, I mean, some Africans are working under the table, but they're easily exploitable by their employers. And for many, it means abject poverty without the ability to sustain themselves. And for others, it's just Israeli security services roaming through the city streets, rounding up Africans off the streets of Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities, and dragging them down to these desert detention centers. And of course, it's in the middle of the desert. It's on the border with Egypt. There's nothing to do, nowhere to go. They get these furloughs where they're allowed to walk out into the desert, but they're far from any population center, and there's not much they can do with that. But you would think that at least the services there would be, somewhat, that they would at least provide minimal services for these people. But no, it's all part of the government's plan to make their lives miserable. That's a direct quote from the Interior Minister. To make their lives miserable. And that even translates into giving them piss-poor medical services. If you can imagine this high-tech marvel, Israel, who supposedly sends, missions all over the world and, nanotech and biotech, but they can't afford beds for these African refugees they've rounded into camps. In this winter, I know it's almost silly to bring this up to a Canadian audience, but it doesn't get nearly as cold there as it does here, but keep in mind, these buildings are insulated. In Israel and Palestine, the houses don't have that level of insulation. So when it gets cold, it gets really, really cold. You can't keep the cold out. And while the snow's coming down and we're going below zero, so the Israeli media runs a puff piece. It's so proud of itself. Aren't we a peace-loving people? Aren't we a loving people? We even installed heaters so the zebras in the zoos don't have to freeze to death. And yet, the government refused to allow heaters for those African refugees that it rounded into these camps. Only they could have one state-issued blanket per person. Even if some of their friends wanted to donate a heater, they wouldn't allow them in. Disgusting. Now, where is Israeli society in all this? Where is the media? Why isn't anyone raising an alarm? Well, human rights groups are doing their best to at least speak about it, to call out the problem. And so you have Human Rights Watch preparing a very detailed report on how the Israeli government is persecuting African asylum seekers. And it invites all the Israeli media outlets to hear this report. And it calls a conference, and not one reporter shows up. So you have the couple African brothers who came to hear what would happen. So he's just like, okay, well, you might as well come up to the front because there's no audience behind you. The seats are completely empty. So just come sit close to me and I'll tell you what my findings are. There was no one who came to hear the report. Now, how did we get to this point that no one cares? That people are rounded into camps and no one cares? Well, there are NGOs who are trying to speak to the Israeli population and convince them to, change the image of African people in their minds, to try to get them to empathize with these African refugees. So they conducted a poster campaign where they paid for these banners to go up around Israel, where they would take photographs of Israelis and Africans together and write Lo Zarim, Chaverim, not foreigners, friends, to try to change people's conceptions of how Africans could easily be integrated into society. They could be partners. They could contribute. But while there are NGOs doing their darndest to try to push in a positive direction, on the other hand, you have top government officials who are doing the opposite, doing everything they can to demonize and to dehumanize these Africans. So you have Miri Regev, the top female official in the ruling Likud party, and she tells a crowd of thousands of Israelis, an anti-African rally in downtown Tel Aviv, she tells them the Sudanese are a cancer in our body. Now, admittedly, she later apologized for her comments. But she didn't apologize to Africans for comparing them to cancer. She apologized to Israeli cancer victims for comparing them to Africans. That's from the top female official in the ruling Likud party, and the top male official in the ruling Likud party, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And he says this summer, Israel is preparing to stop the spread of Ebola, to protect from infiltrators. When you hear infiltrators, you need to understand, again, I'll parse that for you. That's a code word in the Israeli lexicon. Infiltrators is the word they use for African refugees in order to vilify them in the minds of Jewish Israelis. So, comparing them to cancer, comparing them to Ebola, death-causing diseases, that's what Africans are to you? Cancer? Ebola? Well, let's just say that it was already on fertile ground that they were working with, because this summer, an Israeli news site decided to conduct a survey. It's President Obama's birthday. What do you think we should give him for his birthday? And wouldn't you know it, 48% of respondents said an envelope with Ebola. So, let's be honest though. This has been going on for a long time. It's a classic white supremacist tactic to compare black people with death, to create that connection in people's minds. So, just the other week we remember the passing of Malcolm X. It's been exactly 50 years since he was assassinated. And he taught us how the word Negro, said to mean black, comes from the word necro, which means death. So this idea of associating black people and death-causing diseases is a long-term white supremacist tactic. And Netanyahu and the Likud party are just the most recent people to use this tactic. You walk around Tel Aviv, you see posters, white city, advertising new luxury condo developments in the city. Tel Aviv, luxury living, white city. Now, admittedly, it's also a reference to the Bauhaus architecture that Tel Aviv is popular for. It's even recognized by the United Nations as being a heritage, having this architectural heritage of Bauhaus architecture, which commonly features white. But you can't remove it from its context. The context is that Tel Aviv is a city where African people are being ethnically cleansed. You walk through the streets of Tel Aviv, you see graffiti, shchorim, masrichim, habaita, stinky blacks go home. You see graffiti, medina levanim bilvad, this country is for whites only. Tel Aviv, liberal Tel Aviv, the city where Jewish Israelis firebomb African people's homes, where they firebomb an African kindergarten. And the people who did this didn't serve in jail for one day. Tel Aviv, the city where an African mother is holding her baby girl in her arms, a 1-year-old baby, and an Israeli man walks up to them and stabs the baby in the head 3 times. And when the police catch up to this man and they interrogate him and they ask him why he did it, he says, "I tried to kill her because I hate them. They're black. A black baby, blacks in general, are terrorists." Obviously, not every Israeli is going to go out and hack and slash black people. But why did he choose to attack a black baby? Because the government has been inciting racism against them from minute one, of the most vicious kind. Why do you not know about this? Why am I telling you about this now for the first time? Where is the media? Where is the mainstream media?